All right, so in this lecture, we are going to begin to cover the fuel nutrients. And once again, the fuel nutrients are carbohydrates, fats, and protein. And they're referred to fuel nutrients because all three have caloric value. And just as a reminder, carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. Fats have 9 calories per gram, and protein 4 calories per gram. So, to begin with, what we're going to be discussing is carbohydrates. And with carbohydrates, one key thing to remember is they're considered to be the main source of fuel for our bodies. So in other words, when our body needs energy, the first place that it's going to go is to our carbohydrate stores. Now, with carbohydrates, there are considered to be two categories. The first, complex carbohydrates, and the second, simple carbohydrates. And with complex carbohydrates, these sometimes also get nicknamed the good carbs. And the complex carbs should make up the bulk of what we consume. They're considered healthier for us, and in other words, they contain more of the nutrients, more vitamins, minerals, more fiber than our simple carbohydrates do. Simple carbohydrates also get called sugars. A lot of times they're referred to as empty calories. They have little nutritional value beyond the fact that they do provide energy. In other words, they do contain calories. So we're going to look a little more closely at what foods are considered the complex or good carbohydrates and which ones are considered the simple carbohydrates. So, sources of complex carbohydrates, those carbohydrates that we want to be consuming more of, um, breads, beans, rice, pasta, starchy vegetables. Starchy vegetables, those are a lot of our root vegetables like potatoes, carrots. Those are considered starchy vegetables. Beets would also be considered a starchy vegetable. I think a lot of us, when we're consuming complex carbohydrates, we do kind of think towards rice, pasta, breads. And just a reminder, for you, when you're consuming in this category, it's nice if we can also be consuming whole grains. So when choosing your carbohydrates, we want to choose the complex variety, but when it comes to the various foods like breads, rices, if we can go with the brown breads, the brown rices. And these days there are plenty of whole wheat pastas. Those are going to be good sources for our complex carbs. And I don't want to negate the importance of getting carbohydrates through your vegetables. Vegetables are also a really good source of complex carbohydrates. So the second question, what foods are high in simple carbohydrates? Well, think think about cookies, cakes, um, Pop Tarts, certain types of cereal. The simple carbs, again, they're going to be higher in sugars. There's not a whole lot of nutritional value, for example, in a cookie or in cake, but they are considered a type of carbohydrate, but the simple type. Okay, this third question, where do carbohydrates fit into the My Plate guidelines? Some of them are going to be fitting into the grain category. Some will fit into the vegetable category. And fruits also are considered a type of carbohydrate. So carbohydrates actually fit in several spots. I think a lot of times because grains and pasta especially are considered those bulkier sorts, we sometimes just think grains. But yeah, we sometimes just think carbohydrates are the grains, but do keep in mind that vegetables and fruit are going to fall into the higher carbohydrate sources. And once again, how many calories are in 1 gram of carbohydrate? There are 4. Okay, this is something that I really like to cover with this section on carbohydrates. I feel like it's really, really important. And this is where I'm going to ask you once again to start looking at nutrition facts labels. And with carbohydrates, I feel like it's really important for us to get very good at determining if a carbohydrate source is actually a good one. If it's really truly more so in that category of complex carbohydrates. And a guideline that I like to teach is something that I just call the 10% guideline. And let's go ahead and take a look at a nutrition facts label. And I think this will help you understand a little better. So when you look at a nutrition facts label, again, you're going to see the fuel nutrients listed in this section. And if we look at total carbohydrates, we can see that it's identifying that there are 17 grams of carbohydrate in 1 serving. What we don't know if we just look at this is, well, is this actually a good source of carbohydrates? Is this particular food, does it contain mostly complex carbs? If you look beneath the total carbohydrates, what you're going to see is dietary fiber. Dietary fiber is considered a complex carbohydrate. And then you see sugars. Sugars are the refined carbohydrates. Okay, so in this particular food, in 1 serving, 14 of the 17 total carbohydrates are considered sugars. So just in eyeballing that, you would be able to tell with this particular food, wow, most of the carbohydrates in this food are actually sugars. Okay, but there will be some other labels where you might look at total carbs and sugars and not exactly know, well, is that too much? Is that particular food, is the sugar content pretty high in the carbohydrate category? So this 10% guideline, what I like to tell students is if you'll use this 10% guideline, you can determine real easily if that particular food has a high sugar profile, in the carbohydrate section. So if we look at total carbohydrates, there are 17. The next question we need to ask ourselves is, well, what is 10% of 17? 10% of 17 is 1.7. Okay, and let's just do a couple of others here. If it said 33 grams of carbohydrates, 10% would be 3.3. If it said 45 grams of carbohydrates, 10% would be 4.5. I like using this rule because it's easy to calculate. You can look at any food and go, okay, has 17 grams of carbohydrates, 10% is 1.7. So what that's telling me is if I go on down to sugars, in a perfect world, I'm going to see sugars that are at 1.7 or less. So if my carbohydrate profile, if the sugars are only 10% or less of what the total carbs are, I can look at that food and go, okay, that's actually a pretty good carbohydrate source. It's mostly complex, which means it's not too high in the simple carbs or the sugars. So I've left a couple of the turning point clicker questions in the slide, in this slideshow, a few of them today. So um, we're gonna cover those as we go along. So carbohydrates are the primary source of blank for the body. And the correct answer would be fuel. Okay, so hopefully everyone is thinking fuel. And we'll take a look at this next one. Sugars should comprise no more than what percent of your total caloric intake? Now, this says total caloric intake. And the answer is 10%. And that is the bigger rule. When it comes to the number of calories that we consume in a day, we don't want sugars to be making up more than 10% of the total calories we consume in a day. What I've done is taken this 10% guideline and actually just applied it to the carbohydrate profile. And in doing that, I've given you a real conservative guideline for looking at carbohydrates. If you can follow that 10% rule, you're going to stay in really good shape. In fact, as you're looking at labels, what you might discover is that it can be hard to actually find foods, especially if you're eating boxes, canned frozen foods that actually will show you that sugars are staying at 10% or below. We add so much sugar to our foods. But if you can calculate 10%, and in this case again, 10% is 1.7, and I look down here and wow, this is at 14. That can tell you this food, technically, the carbohydrate profile is not a very good one. And we wouldn't want to make this type of food a mainstay of our diet. Okay, so here we go. If there are 32 grams of total carbohydrates in one serving, it is ideal if the grams of simple carbohydrates are no more than, remember, simple carbohydrates on the label, it's going to say sugars. So applying that 10% rule, 10% of 32 is 3.2. So the answer is going to be B. All right. So as you noticed, or as I was pointing out, fiber is listed on a nutrition facts label under the carbohydrate section because fiber is considered a complex carbohydrate. It's one of the good carbs. And the reason why it is listed on the nutrition facts label is because we tend to not consume enough fiber. That's a problem area in the typical American diet. And fiber is important for a lot of different reasons, and here are a few. Consuming enough fiber, it actually is going to help relieve or prevent constipation. It's going to reduce your risk for diverticular disease. Consuming enough fiber is going to decrease your risk for type 2 diabetes. Also, it's going to decrease your risk for heart disease. Another great thing about fiber is when you consume foods that are higher in fiber, they do tend to leave you with this feeling of being full. And so consuming high fiber foods can actually help with weight management or help us when we're attempting to decrease our weight. So, and in fact, I'm not sure how Weight Watchers works these days, but I know just a few years ago, with Weight Watchers on their point system, if you were consuming foods that were high in fiber, the point value wasn't as high. Weight Watchers utilizes the system where you can consume so many points per day, and foods have different point values. So, Weight Watchers really tries to emphasize the importance of getting fiber. The point value is much less on those foods that are higher in fiber. Now, with fiber, there are actually two types of fiber. The first is called insoluble, the second, soluble. And they serve different purposes. The insoluble fiber is the type of fiber that allows food residues to pass through the intestinal tract more quickly. Okay, so insoluble fiber actually helps keep things moving through you, and that's really important because it if things are moving through our system as they should be, that's going to be limiting our exposure to waste product, also limiting exposure and absorption time of toxic substances within waste. So usually in class, I ask, well, when it comes to having bowel movements, how often are you actually supposed to have bowel movements? And there's usually a range of responses. Some people will say 2 or 3 times a day. Some people will say once every couple of days. And just in general, we're we're supposed to be having one complete evacuation daily. And it's going to depend a bit per individual. But if that's not happening for you on a daily basis, and let's just say you're skipping days over a long period of time, that could mean that you're moving into constipation. Um, and it would be a really important thing to talk to your doctor about. But it's this particular type of fiber, insoluble fiber, that can really help us stay regular. Okay, soluble fiber, it helps the body excrete fats and paces the absorption of cholesterol, which helps prevent dramatic shifts in blood sugar levels. So, if you are a person who has to really work at maintaining healthy blood sugar levels, making sure that you're consuming fiber sources that are in the soluble category are really important. It's important for us to be consuming both. But I think it's nice to understand there are a couple of different types of fiber and to also know what these two types are doing for us in terms of helping us maintain good health. All right, so let's look at another nutrition facts label. And, just back here again, once again, to total carbohydrates, you're seeing the dietary fiber listed here. One of the 17 grams is considered carbohydrates. But I also wanted to point out to you right now the very bottom portion of the nutrition facts labels. On some of your labels, you will continue to see this. On some of the newer ones, it's not going to be there anymore. But I did want to show this to you because I actually like that it's there. It can be a good guide for us. Down at the bottom, what you're seeing is this list of total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium, total fiber, dietary fiber. Okay, the reason for this list is because this represents actually some of our problem areas with, once again, that typical American diet. We tend to consume too much total fat. There's a tendency for us to consume too much saturated fat. We tend to consume too much cholesterol. We definitely tend to consume too much sodium. And we tend to not get enough fiber. And down at the bottom, there are two columns. There's one that says 2,000, one that says 2,500. You can use these as guides. If you eat closer to 2,000 calories a day, underneath it's telling you approximately how many grams or milligrams you are supposed to consume and not exceed. Okay, dietary fiber, we're not as concerned about exceeding that. We're concerned about getting enough of it. And then if you're consuming closer to 2,500 calories a day, you've got some guidelines here for that number of calories. Um, and again, this is going to be a real general idea also. The 2,000 column a lot of times will work for women. The 2,500 column is a lot of times a better column for men. Okay, one problem with these nutrition facts labels is that some of the information is no longer completely accurate. For example, fiber recommending 25 grams for people eating 2,000 calories a day and 30 for people eating 2,500. If you look at your own project to see what has been recommended for you in terms of fiber intake, that's going to be a better estimate for you. Okay, we've actually, with fiber, the recommendation has increased. Most of the women in class are going to end up, and it will show up this way in your projects. You're going to see that they're recommending you consume maybe 28, 29 grams of fiber a day. It's going to vary a bit in class. And then with the guys, a lot of the guys in class, you guys are going to end up seeing that they're telling you, maybe to consume maybe 32 to 35 grams. So this recommendation on the nutrition facts label has been revised, but I like that it's here still because it's giving us something to shoot for. Both of these numbers are going to get us close. I'm going to talk about another revision that's been made with a guideline. It's the sodium guideline, but we'll get to it a little later on when we're talking about regulatory nutrients. All right, so we've got a few more of what would have been clicker questions coming up for you. Actually, just two more. Okay, so fiber is a type of protein, simple carbohydrate, fat, or complex carbohydrate. And hopefully all of you have decided on complex carbohydrate. And last question here. Which type of fiber allows food residue to pass through the intestinal tract more quickly? Is that complex fiber, soluble fiber, refined fiber, or insoluble fiber? Well, the two types of fiber are soluble and insoluble. These other two are not types of fiber. Okay, so it's probably going to take some memorization just to remember which is which here. And the correct answer is insoluble fiber. Insoluble fiber is that type of fiber that helps keep things moving through our system. So hopefully this has been helpful, and I'd like to encourage you to start looking at nutrition facts labels at just that carbohydrate section to see how many of the carbohydrates actually are sugars or refined carbohydrates. and practice using that 10% guideline to determine whether or not that food is actually a good carbohydrate source for you. I think this is actually can be really, really interesting. And I'm not sure yet that in next week's discussion question, I might actually end up asking you um, to identify a food, how many total carbohydrates, and then how many were sugars, and let us know, if that would be considered a good source of carbohydrates or not. So start looking in the cabinets. Okay, so hope you all have a good remainder of the day, and I will talk with you later.